In the narrow alleys of Corleone, children played under the Sicilian sun, but the games often masked a darker reality. Leoluca Bagarella was one of those children. Born in 1942, he grew up in a town where loyalty and silence meant survival. The Mafia wasn't just a rumor whispered in the bars of Corleone. It was family, it was blood, and for young Bagarella, it was destiny. As the years passed, the bright alleys of childhood gave way to darker streets. Corleone, a small town in the hills of Sicily, was no ordinary place. It was the cradle of some of the most ruthless mafia bosses in history. Here, Leoluca Bagarella became the protege of Luciano Leggio, a feared boss who ruled with blood and fear. Bagarella learned quickly, loyalty to the clan meant protection, but betrayal meant death. These narrow Sicilian streets would become the stage where he took his first steps as a killer. In the shadows of Sicily, power was written in silence, and fear was carved into stone. Tonight, we walk those alleys once more. Soldiers, welcome back to Mob Truth. The family grows stronger with every step. Subscribe, stand with us, and let's uncover the bloody rise of Leoluca Bagarella. Leoluca Bagarella grew up in Corleone, Sicily, a place whose name would become synonymous with blood and fear. Unlike many mafiosi who cloaked themselves in a sense of honor, Bagarella's reputation was different. He was known, even among killers, as a maniac, a psychopath. His violence wasn't just calculated, it was often uncontrollable. Those who knew him described a man with a cold stare, quick to anger and quicker to draw his weapon. In the 1960s and 70s, as the Corleonese clan fought for dominance in Sicily, Bagarella became one of their most feared enforcers. He was tied by blood to Luciano Leggio, the boss who first took control of the family, and by marriage to Totò Riina, the future boss of bosses. That combination of family ties and sheer brutality made him untouchable inside the clan. Bagarella's rise came during a period when the Sicilian mafia wasn't just running protection rackets or smuggling, it was waging open war. The Corleonesi wanted to dominate Palermo, and anyone who stood in their way was eliminated. Politicians, rival mafiosi, businessmen, it didn't matter. And Bagarella was always at the front lines, leaving behind trails of blood. He was called Il Pazzo, the madman, not by outsiders, but by fellow mafiosi. They feared him as much as they relied on him. Stories circulated of his rage, his sadistic streak, his willingness to kill not only rivals but even friends if Riina ordered it. Unlike more strategic bosses, Bagarella had no problem getting his hands dirty. For him, pulling the trigger wasn't business. It was personal satisfaction. In the hills and narrow alleys of Sicily, his name alone struck terror. People whispered that if Bagarella was after you, there was no escape. His reputation as a ruthless, psychopathic killer was cemented long before he rose into a position of power. Leoluca Bagarella was more than just a feared killer. He was family. In the early 1970s, his sister Antonietta married Salvatore Totò Riina, the man who would later become Capo dei Capi, the boss of bosses in Sicily. That marriage bound Bagarella and Riina in blood, creating a deadly alliance that strengthened the Corleonese clan's iron grip on Sicily. Riina trusted very few people completely, but Bagarella was one of them. He wasn't just a brother-in-law, he was an executioner, a guardian, and a partner in terror. Wherever Riina plotted, Bagarella was never far behind. He carried out hits with cold precision, eliminating judges, politicians, rivals, and anyone foolish enough to cross the Corleonesi. Bagarella's violent streak, combined with Riina's strategic mind, created a lethal balance. Riina gave the orders, Bagarella pulled the trigger. In those years, Sicily bled under the so-called Second Mafia War, a conflict that turned Palermo into a battlefield. Hundreds of rivals from the Bontad, Inzerio, and Badalamenti clans were gunned down. Families that had controlled Palermo for decades were wiped out. Their leaders ambushed in the streets, their soldiers hunted down one by one. Witnesses later said that Bagarella often relished the violence. His enemies didn't just die, they were made examples of. Bodies were left in cars riddled with bullets or dumped on the side of the road. These weren't random murders. They were messages, signed in blood, telling Sicily that the Corleonesi were unstoppable. But Bagarella wasn't only Riina's triggerman. He also became a key strategist, managing the flow of weapons, money, and information. He sat in on meetings where the Corleonesi planned their war on Palermo and later their war on the Italian state itself. His reputation as a maniac didn't stop him from being respected, because in Riina's world, fear was respect. By the 1980s, with Riina at the top and Bagarella at his side, the Corleonesi had turned into the most feared faction in Cosa Nostra. And behind every headline about bloodshed, behind every assassination, you could almost guarantee that Bagarella's shadow was somewhere nearby. By the early 1980s, Palermo was no longer just a city, it was a battlefield. The Second Mafia War had exploded, and at the center of the carnage stood Totò Riina and his most ruthless enforcer, Leoluca Bagarella. The Corleonesi were determined to wipe out every rival clan in Sicily. Stefano Bontati, Salvatore Inzerillo, Gaetano Badalamenti, men who once ruled Palermo, were hunted like prey. One by one, their empires crumbled under a wave of killings, cars riddled with bullets, bodies dumped in alleys, explosions shaking entire neighborhoods. The message was simple. Palermo belonged to Corleone, and Bagarella's name was whispered at nearly every crime scene. He was the gunman who never hesitated, the man who could strike in broad daylight, leaving blood on the cobblestones before vanishing into the night. Survivors described him as a ghost, quick, merciless, and cold-blooded. In a city drowning in fear, Bagarella became the executioner everyone knew, but no one dared name aloud. The scale of violence was staggering. Hundreds were killed, not only mafiosi, but judges, police, and innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire. Bagarella carried out orders with maniacal precision. For Riina, it was strategy. For Bagarella, it was instinct. Witnesses and collaborators later testified that his appetite for killing went beyond loyalty. It was a compulsion. The brutality changed the balance of power. Families that had controlled Palermo for decades were erased in just a few years. The Corleonesi, with Riina at the top and Bagarella as his iron fist, ruled through terror. Even within Cosa Nostra, men who once believed in the old code of honor recoiled at the savagery unleashed by Bagarella and his allies. By the time the dust settled, Palermo had become a graveyard of former bosses. The Corleonesi now controlled not only Corleone, but the capital itself. And Bagarella, once the reckless nephew in the shadows, had carved his name into history as one of the most feared killers Sicily had ever produced. On May 23, 1992, the ground shook in Sicily. A highway outside Palermo was torn apart by half a ton of explosives. Judge Giovanni Falcone, Italy's most relentless anti-mafia magistrate, was assassinated in what became known as the Capaci massacre. His wife and 3 bodyguards died alongside him. The order came from Totò Riina, but the hands that helped prepare and carry out the bloodshed included his most loyal lieutenant, Leoluca Bagarella. For decades, Falcone had hunted the Corleonesi, building cases, convicting hundreds in the Maxi trial. To Riina and Bagarella, Falcone represented the greatest threat Cosa Nostra had ever faced. Eliminating him was more than revenge. It was a declaration of war on the Italian state. Bagarella was instrumental in this campaign of terror. He was at the heart of the Stragismo strategy, a series of bombings and assassinations designed to intimidate judges, politicians, and civilians alike. Only weeks after Falcone, another magistrate, Paolo Borsellino, was murdered in similar fashion. Across Sicily, fear turned into national outrage. For the first time, millions of Italians marched in the streets, demanding justice. Investigators later described Bagarella's role as central, not only as a killer, but as an organizer. He had risen from a Corleone street soldier into one of the most feared figures in Cosa Nostra's leadership. The maniac enforcer was now helping to shape strategy, a strategy of violence that backfired, because the Capaci massacre changed everything. Instead of breaking the state, it united it. The Italian government unleashed an unprecedented crackdown. Military units in Sicily, new anti-mafia laws, mass arrests. The wave that Riina and Bagarella unleashed would, in time, lead to their own downfall. Palermo, 1995. The streets that once trembled at the mere whisper of his name now bore witness to his downfall. After years on the run, hiding behind safe houses in silence, Leoluca Bagarella was finally captured. The Carabinieri moved in with precision. Armed officers closed the net, and the man who had spilled so much blood was dragged into daylight. Neighbors pressed against balconies, children peeked from behind shutters, old men shook their heads in disbelief. For decades, Bagarella had been the ghost of Corleone, untouchable, merciless, feared even by his own men. But now, bound in handcuffs, he shuffled past a crowd that no longer cowered, but stared. Some in anger, others in relief. His arrest was not a small event. It was the result of years of relentless investigation. Police wiretaps, pentiti testimonies, the dogged persistence of magistrates, all converged on this moment. Bagarella had tried to keep Cosa Nostra alive after Totò Riina's capture in 1993, but he lacked Riina's cunning. His rule was pure violence, and by the mid-1990s, it was violence without control. As he was escorted to the waiting Alfa Romeo squad car, Bagarella's face betrayed nothing. No remorse, no fear. Only the cold stare of a man who had lived his life through brutality. But this was more than the arrest of one mafioso. It was a symbol. The Corleonesi, once rulers of Sicily, were being dismantled piece by piece. The people watching in that narrow Palermo street understood what they were seeing, the beginning of the end. A man who once dictated massacres and murders was now reduced to a prisoner. The Mafia's war against the state had finally turned against itself, and Bagarella's capture was proof that even the most feared could not escape forever. Behind the steel doors of Italy's toughest prisons, Leoluca Bagarella vanished from the streets of Sicily. After his arrest in 1995, he was placed under the infamous 41 bis regime, solitary confinement designed to sever every mafia boss from the outside world. No phone calls, no contact. Letters censored, every movement watched. For a man who once dictated massacres, the silence was suffocating. Yet Bagarella still tried to cling to power. Investigators uncovered messages he attempted to smuggle through family visits and lawyers, proof that even caged he sought to command fear. But the days of absolute terror were gone. The state had learned. The era of massacres had closed. Life behind bars stripped him of the myth he built in blood. The psycho Butcher of Corleone was reduced to a number, an inmate locked in a cell for 23 hours a day. Judges sentenced him to multiple life terms for murders, bombings, and his role in the Stragismo campaign. No parole, no mercy. From the outside, Sicily moved on. Streets once ruled by gunfire filled again with families, markets, and laughter. The Mafia still existed, but never again with the same brutal arrogance that Bagarella embodied. And inside those prison walls, the man who believed he could bend a nation with fear was left to fade, a relic of Cosa Nostra's darkest years. The prison walls that swallowed Leoluca Bagarella were built not just of stone and steel, but of vigilance. Under the 41 bis regime, every corridor echoed with the boots of guards, every door sealed like a fortress. Other inmates leaned from their cells, watching as Bagarella was escorted through the courtyard. Here there were no gunmen at his side, no loyal soldiers ready to kill at his command. Instead, he walked under the eyes of the state, rifles pointed outward, cameras recording every move. For years, Bagarella had been the shadow of Corleone, a figure of dread whose whispers carried death. Now he was simply another prisoner, one among many, stripped of power by the very system he once sought to overthrow. The man who helped unleash bombings and massacres in the heart of Italy now lived in a place designed to erase his reach, a cage within a cage. And while he still dreamed of control, the walls of this prison made sure those dreams would never again spill blood on the Sicilian soil. Sicily, a land of sun, stone, and silence. Rolling hills covered in vineyards, olive groves stretching toward the horizon, small villages where time seemed to stand still. It was in these places that the Mafia was born, not in the crowded streets of Palermo, but in the quiet fields of Corleone. This countryside shaped men like Leoluca Bagarella. Among the stone farmhouses and narrow lanes, respect and fear became the currency of life. Honor was tied to blood, disputes were settled in whispers, and loyalty to family often outweighed loyalty to the law. To outsiders, it was a land of beauty. To those inside, it was a land that bred both tradition and terror. The Bagarella family lived and worked in these hills, and from a young age, Leoluca absorbed the code of silence, the omertà that kept the Mafia hidden for generations. He watched as older men conducted business in the shadows, as vendettas scarred families for decades. What for most was a simple life of farming and survival, for him became training grounds for a career of violence. From the soil of Corleone grew vines that would produce wine, and men who would produce bloodshed. It is the cruel irony of Sicily, a place where life and death are forever intertwined, where beauty masks brutality. As Bagarella rose through Cosa Nostra, he never lost that connection to the land. The Mafia called itself La Campagna, the countryside, as if to remind everyone that its roots were as deep as the olive trees. Every stone farmhouse could be a meeting point, every vineyard a hiding place, every shepherd a messenger. But while the land remained eternal, the men who claimed to control it were not. For centuries, the fields endured wars, invasions, famines. And so they endured the Mafia too. Even as Bagarella and Riina unleashed massacres, even as they tried to bend Italy through terror, the countryside continued its rhythm. Grapes ripened, olives were pressed, children played in dusty squares. Life always found a way to outlast fear. Today, when one looks at these hills, it's hard to imagine the violence that once spilled over them. Yet buried in that soil is the memory of men like Bagarella, men who mistook cruelty for strength and silence for power. The land remains, they do not. In the end, this was all that remained of Leoluca Bagarella. Not the fire of gunshots in Palermo, not the terror of bombs on Italian highways, but an old man, caged, living out his days in the courtyard of a prison. He once strutted through the streets of Corleone with soldiers at his side. Now he shuffled across cracked pavement, surrounded not by killers, but by other aging inmates. A cup of bitter coffee in his hand, a cigar burning slowly, small comforts in a life that had narrowed to walls and wire. For decades, Bagarella's name was whispered with fear. Mothers hushed children, judges looked over their shoulders, even other mafiosi stepped carefully around him. But time is the one enemy even the most ruthless cannot escape. Here in the shade of the prison blocks, the psycho Butcher of Corleone was nothing more than another old man waiting for the years to finish what bullets could not. Outside, Sicily moved on. The vineyards bloomed, the markets filled with life, and children played in the same villages that once gave birth to the Mafia's most feared killers. Bagarella's war against the state had failed, leaving behind no empire, no victory, only a broken legacy of blood and silence. This is how power ends in Cosa Nostra, not in glory, but in decay. And for Leoluca Bagarella, once the enforcer of the Corleonesi, history will remember not his strength, but his fall. And so the story of Leoluca Bagarella comes to its end, from the narrow alleys of Corleone, where silence was law, to the violent campaigns of terror that shook all of Italy, and finally to the cold walls of a prison cell where time stripped away his power. Cosa Nostra thought fear would make them immortal, but history proved otherwise. The land of Sicily endured, the state endured, the people endured, and the men who tried to rule through blood all fell one by one. The man you've just seen was once one of the most feared killers in Italy. Today, he is only a shadow, locked away, remembered not for victory, but for brutality and defeat. This is Mob Truth. We bring you the rise and fall of the underworld, the secrets, the betrayals, the legends and the ghosts that shaped history. Welcome to the family, soldier. If you've just joined us, hit that subscribe, become part of the crew, and stand with us in the alley where the truth always survives. Because here, in the shadows, the story never ends.